and then the body carries that. And really, if you think about who we are, who our makeup is as this body, it's been said we are what we eat. But it's actually more true, we are what we absorb. So if you're not breaking down and not doing this very good, it's going to be very hard for your body to build muscles and repair itself and have energy and all of those things. So there is problems that we run into too in the small intestine and the absorption rate there. And I'm going to get into that here in a minute. I'm going to back up and go through all of this one more time and describe you the problems. But we want to keep the food moving at this point so you guys can get a good picture of everything and the way it happens. So it's going to go through 20 feet of small intestine all the way along. It's going to pick up as much of the nutrients off of that food as it possibly can. And then it's going to go through what we call the ileocecal valve and enter into the large intestine. The large intestine is also known as the colon. So if you've heard those two terms, those are interchangeable. The colon or large intestine is about 5 feet or so for each person. All right? So the large intestine is basically just a storage area until it can be excreted from the body. And the large intestine is still not a garden hose. Okay? So it's still not completely closed off. It's still porous. And so if you had someone say they were constantly throwing up for several days, and they went to the doctor and said, "Doctor, I am so sick, I cannot keep anything down, I'm constantly throwing up," then the doctor would probably give them something called a rectal suppository of some kind. Because, of course, if he gives them a pill to swallow, they're just going to pitch it right back out again, right? So he gives them a rectal suppository, and the reason that can work so well is because the colon is very porous, and it can absorb right away into the body, and that medication can help the person get to the point where they're not sick, okay? So in any case, that colon is still porous. So if you've got food that is sitting in there for long periods of time, food does rot after a while, okay? So I want you to think about this little scenario here, okay? I'm going to give you a little story. Say and here in Montana, we do get hot weather some of the time. We haven't had much lately, so we're kind of going, darn, we want some of that, right? But it can get, say, 90 degrees here in the summertime. And so you've got, 90, 95 degrees out there, and we decide all to have a barbecue, right? So I invite all you to my house to have a barbecue, and for whatever reason, you guys decided you had other things to do and you didn't like Sherie that day. Right? And you're like, no, I'm not going. And so I have all this food, and maybe only a handful of people show up. And of course, I have all this food, and there's no possible way we can eat it all. And so it, is all out on the deck. And if I was extremely depressed about the fact that you guys did not come to my barbecue, then I would go, oh, I'm just going to leave all this here and go to bed, right? So I leave it all there. Remember, it's 90 degrees out there, right? I go to bed. I get up the next day. Would any of you, if you got up the next day, go out there and eat that food for breakfast? No. Okay, but remember, our bodies run at 98.6. Okay? So that food can sit in there, and it literally can rot for days. And so you really need to know the transit time. So the transit time from the start of it going in your mouth to it exiting out the colon should be about 9 hours, anywhere from 9 to 12 hours. And there is a way for you to find out what is this transit time, okay? So what you all need to do, this is another challenge for y'all, right? Another challenge here. The challenge is to eat corn, don't chew it very well, eat corn on an empty stomach, all right? Everybody's laughing here.
30 times.
No, at this point, don't chew it really well, okay? Because corn has an outside shell on it, and that outside shell does not break down in the digestive tract. And so if you don't chew it very well, you'll actually get to see that little kernels of corn coming out the other end. And the reason that is so valuable is that you can actually get to count how many hours it took. And I have known people, in fact, when I was in nutrition classes, we actually did this. And we were there for a good period of time, and so everybody was like, did you find your corn? Did you find your corn? And there was some people in there that did not find their corn until 2 weeks later. Okay? So then this is where things like colon cancer, that's very highly on the rise in the United States, comes from, okay? Things like this. Okay, and there's certain foods that really slow down the movement of the colon. And one of those foods that really slow down the movement of the colon is things like white flour. And those of you watching by YouTube, you can actually go into the other seminar that I do called Thrive, Survive, Foods That Heal, Foods That Hurt. And I will go into this more on foods that are harmful to the body. But for those of you here, when you're in kindergarten and you mix flour and water together, what do you get? Glue, yes. You get paste. And so how much water is in this body? A lot of water in here, okay? And so you eat a great big heavy bagel, how much flour in there, what's that going to do to the colon? It's going to slow things down. And that also really upsets the small intestine. So let's start going backwards now. Everything that I've explained to you from start to finish, let's start going backwards and explain some of the problems that some of these people start having. So we'll go to the small intestine. So remember, I said the small intestine is like a round tube, right? But it's porous. It's not a garden hose. It's got the villi. If you get people who are eating a lot of white flour, what starts happening is all of these villi get all gummed up together. And they're all stuck up together. And then the food can't really pass through them very well because they're all goomed together. And then sometimes they're so goomed together that they completely lay over on the side of the wall. And it leaves a great big old place for it to pass through, and that the food doesn't get absorbed well. The other thing that happens is, remember I said that the wall of the colon is porous, right? And so if these villi are completely laying over or they're all gummed up, what can start happening is that wall that is still there, this is where you call leaky gut, right? That wall that is still there, the food will start leaching into that incorrectly because it didn't bond with the enzyme and it didn't go in through the villi. All right, so when you start getting things like leaky gut, and that's very, very common, especially with any white flour foods, and a lot of our food today, especially our wheat today, is no longer the wheat that our grandparents used to eat. Wheat has been genetically altered and modified, and it's very hard. It's a very hard kernel now compared to what it was when your grandparents were here, right? And so what happens is that wheat is very hard to break down, and it'll sit there, but it'll still be very gummy and messy. This is where people get a lot of problems with gluten foods, and they become gluten intolerant, and then they can actually become what we call celiac disease. And celiac disease, basically the immune system gets involved because the food has passed beyond that wall into the bloodstream incorrectly. And so the body begins to look at that as though it's a foreign substance. And it goes, this can't be here. This is wrong. This is a wrong protein to be here. And so it begins to attack that. So then as the person keeps eating this food, there's an autoimmune response where the body begins to attack that area. Okay? And they end up having a lot of bloating in the gut and a lot of issues that way. Okay? So that's explaining some of the issues happening in the small intestine. Let's back up into the duodenum, right? So we're going to talk about digestion and what didn't get digested, okay? So if you were in the duodenum and you had eaten those French fries I was talking about, right? And say your gallbladder was all clogged up and not giving you the bile, then the grease would not get broke down very well. And so things like that can start happening, and the body's going to do something with some of that fat. So it might start packing more pounds on you, right? You might start getting more pounds because the gallbladder is not working correctly. And of course, if it gets really bad where it's not working correctly at all, then you have a gallbladder attack and you're in so much pain and you end up in the hospital. The doctor will take out the gallbladder. And the doctor says, oh, you don't need that anyway. Why is that here? They don't need that. You can digest the food just fine without that gallbladder. But remember, it was the gallbladder that receives the signal when you've eaten 10 French fries, right? So when you've eaten the 10 French fries, that gallbladder is no longer there to receive that signal, but they have to leave a tube from the liver into the small intestine because the liver makes the bile. So the liver makes the bile, and then you're always getting a little bit of bile into the small intestine all the time. The other part of the problem that happens here is that the liver gets overworked when this happens, because this whole mechanism was set up because the liver has a lot of jobs to do. And when the gallbladder is not there, then the liver can never rest from making the bile. So you can kind of think of it like this. Say you're living in a house and that house has a well, and that has a water well. So you get the water, comes out of the well, and it's a pump that pumps the water out of that well. And then that water goes into a storage tank. And when you turn the water on in your faucet, then the water comes out of the storage tank, and then as that storage tank level water comes down, then it'll get to a certain level and it kicks on the water pump. Okay, this is very similar to what happens with the liver and gallbladder. The liver makes bile, it goes into that gallbladder. When the gallbladder gets enough bile, the liver goes, oh, good, I can rest, right? And so it takes a rest. And then it can do other jobs, all right? So one of the things that the liver does is it filters anything toxic. And I just read a few months ago about things that are in our foods that shouldn't be there. Preservatives, right? We have a lot of preservatives in our foods. We have a lot of colorings and dyes in our foods. I mean, we're even getting things like toxic chemicals from things being sprayed on our foods. And we consume at least 9 pounds of that kind of stuff every year as an American. All right, so as we consume 9 pounds of that, the liver has to filter all that junk. So that's one of the things it does. The other things it does is it filters everything else we're exposed to. So say you walk down the road and you're exposed to diesel fuel, and you breathe in diesel fumes from the diesel truck. Say you're painting your house and you're painting the wall and you're exposed to the paint fumes of painting the wall. You walk into the bank and the bank has just gotten new flooring and new carpeting, and you can smell all that glue from the flooring, right? So all of that stuff gets breathed into the lungs. What's the body going to do with it? How's it going to get it back out of there? The only way it can is the lungs will pick up that toxic stuff through the blood, the bloodstream, and it will dump it down through the liver because the liver is your filter. So the liver gets to the point, if it doesn't have a gallbladder, the liver gets to the point where it is struggling to do all of these jobs that it does. Okay? So that's the scenario with the gallbladder liver situation.